I'm Betsy Brune. I'm the director, and I'm late. I'm really sorry. I've been waiting in my office going, oh my God, I should have gone earlier. Because you may not know since you've been here, is that the heavens just opened up and there are sheets of driving rain coming down and rivers running down all the streets. I kept thinking it's going to stop. But this plays right into Eleanor's talk, in which the heavens and the weather responds to the affairs of men, right?
Absolutely.
So you're in for a treat. I know you had an exciting day talking about interdisciplinary things and how art relates to all the other aspects of our lives. It is what we love doing here, is taking the very best artworks by the very greatest artists and trying to sort of map how they reveal all the concerns that lie outside the artwork. You know, we love all the formal stuff, line, form, color, composition, all of that, but that's not actually what we do. We're a national museum. We host huge audiences from around the country, from every part of every state of this great country, and we want people to find themselves and their own experiences reflected in our museum by looking at these artworks and seeing that on some level they're telling us what it was like then. Then might be yesterday or last week, or then might be 100 years ago or 200 years ago. No matter what the artist's individual personal concerns were, they're seeing through the lens of their own age and their own place and their own time. And there are clues in the artwork that tell us what were those terms and conditions of their world that we can understand and read from here. So I know most of you are from either English language studies or social studies or history. We really love sort of putting our primary documents in your world because you have the skills and the knowledge to do that mapping back. What does it really mean? We've got a great team of people in this program. Victoria, who I regret to say is moving on to other greatness. We're sorry to lose her. She helped create these institutes. And of course, Addie and all the other helpers who make it so great. So it's a joy for us to have you here. We really want you to get the, once you come here and work for a week, we consider you're always part of the team. No matter where you go and what you do and what else you decide to take up later in life, you should always feel affiliated here. We're a very public service-oriented place, and we want to be in your classroom and the classroom next door and the classroom down the hall, so tell your friends. I don't want to take too much time because Eleanor herself has quite an amazing story to tell you today. I just want to take a word to say that she is one of our most distinguished scholars. She's been with us a decade or more. She is knowledgeable about all American art across the whole full sweep from early colonial down to today. But this topic that she's talking to you about today is the subject of her recent years of research. I would say there's no one in the country who knows this story better than Eleanor. And you're going to be hearing about some of the new insights that she has as we prepare for a major show that we open here in mid-November. And after we open it here, I think next Memorial Day, it goes to the Met in New York. So she's written a brilliant book. It's going to be very exciting. We think it tells us, her research tells us something really important about the Civil War that maybe lies below all the factoids and the battles and the generals and the mere facts of the war history. The artists tell us the emotional meaning of what those events meant for them. So we're very, very excited and happy to be featuring her. I might just add that she got her start way back as a child when she was a graduate student at Yale, working here as a research assistant in the summer on a project I was doing. And she made a major contribution to that as well. It was a book and show about the art of Albert Pinkham Ryder. Another great cultural study in its own right. Couldn't have done it without her. And so we've been a team for a long time, and I'm really excited that you can hear from her today. And I'm excited that the weather has responded to make your points so beautifully. Thanks.
Thank you, Betsy, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon talking to you about the intersection of art, history, and literature in a way of understanding what art has to tell us about the Civil War. In 1861, America went to war with itself. The Civil War has been described as the Second American Revolution, a conflict that cut to the heart of the founding precepts of this nation and threatened to topple our democracy. From 1859, when it was clear war was imminent, through 1876, when the nation sought closure to the conflict at the centennial, the Civil War was never far from anyone's thoughts. Walt Whitman bemoaned the real war would never make it into the books. And by that, he meant the story of the war as it was experienced by those who fought it and by those whose lives were forever altered by it. It's not an overstatement to say that the war changed everything about American politics and culture, but today I want to make the point that it changed everything about American art as well. I began work on this project years ago in order to answer a question. In the midst of the war, when it's not clear who's winning, how long it would last, or what would happen next, what do you paint? To see how this war was understood in the moment without the benefit of hindsight, the answer lay at the intersection of art, literature, and history. I found it in first-person singular narratives, in soldiers' diaries, officers' reports, private letters and public speeches, and in the published literature and sermons of the day. I was looking for a universally felt language to describe highly personal experiences. And from there, it was a short distance to the paintings themselves. Not surprisingly then, the links between art and the written word that provided the strongest body of evidence for the war as a suffusing, suffocating force came in American art. Surprisingly few American artists engaged directly with the war as it was being fought. There was little market for depictions of Americans killing one another, and artists found it difficult to immediately identify the heroes and the pivotal battles. Without the luxury of time and reflection, these artists approached the Civil War in a more elliptical manner. My purpose is to tease out the war-inflected layer of meaning in some of the most powerful paintings and photographs made during and immediately after the war years. My intent is to show that these works of art make manifestly clear that this conflict not only unleashed historical events of great moment, but also wrought great changes in the nation's visual culture and character. I do want to start this conversation on familiar terrain. When most of us think about the Civil War in American art, the artist who most readily comes to mind is Winslow Homer, whose painting Sharpshooter from 1863 you see here. Homer had just turned 25 when war broke out. He was a fledgling artist and had not yet embarked on the painting career we now know so well. But the war made Winslow Homer. It shaped his personality, his career, and in many ways the trajectory of American art, away from the romantic visions of history painting and toward a compelling and personal empathy with the common soldier. In a letter written in 1896, Homer sketched a sharpshooter at work. He referred to it in recollection as the closest thing to murder he had ever witnessed, and he professed a horror for that branch of the military arts. That cold-blooded reality undermined the romanticism that had been a staple part of the way we had depicted the American Revolution. The year later, Homer painted a work called Home Sweet Home, which is in the National Gallery of Art down the street. It was a tune that made men question why they fought. Soldiers on both sides wrote that at Fredericksburg, when the military bands struck up different tunes, they had a battle of the bands on either side of the Rappahannock River that December. The northern side playing Yankee Doodle, the southern side playing Dixie. But when one band broke out in Home Sweet Home, every other regimental band on both sides of the river picked it up and they played it in unison. One South Carolina infantryman wrote in his diary, "If there hadn't been a river between us, we would have shaken hands and gone home that night." By 1864, the Union Army considered banning the song for fear of mass desertions in the wake of the draft riots. Homer's focus on nameless individual soldiers stemmed in part from the brutal battlefield images taken by photographers who brought the relatively new medium into prominence as a tool for capturing and interpreting history as it happened. In Alexander Gardner's work from Antietam, which you see here, for the first time Americans saw at home pictures of corpses strewn across battlefields. bringing, as the New York Times called it, the war to our doorstep. Their visceral impact sucked the air out of the room, spurring genre painters to try to restore some sense of empathy to the human drama unfolding across the nation. Now, another artist that you would expect to find in an exhibition about the Civil War, and you will find him, is Eastman Johnson, whose painting Negro Life at the South from 1859 you see on the screen. Eastman Johnson made painting race a central issue on the eve of the war. This painting basically goes into a sliding scale of skin tone from very dark to very light, raising the question of at what point along that spectrum does a person become property. In 1862, Eastman Johnson accompanied George McClellan to Centerville, Virginia, in advance of the Second Battle of Manassas. He witnessed a family of blacks escaped from slavery, trying to make it to Union lines to be accepted as contraband. But what Johnson also knew at the time was that McClellan was routinely turning back these escapees and handing them back into slavery. And so the certainty that one would assume would come along with a picture like Ride for Liberty that you see here is undermined by that queasy notion of not knowing what fate will befall them when they do in fact reach the safety of the Union lines. In 1863, in a painting that's now in the collection here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, he painted a work called The Lord is My Shepherd, in which a strapping young black man is reading the Bible. In 1864, Harper's Weekly ran an article in which they stated, "The alphabet is an abolitionist. If you wish to keep a people enslaved, forbid to teach them to read." Literacy was viewed as a path to freedom every bit as potent as an escape across the battlefield. This young man, however, is not reading the Psalms, which are in the middle of the Bible. He has opened it to the front of the Bible. I believe he is reading Exodus with the message, "Let my people go." Johnson and Homer are two of the artists who anchor the exhibition that we will debut this November. But in order to understand the intersection of art and literature with the Civil War, I want to focus primarily on artists that you don't expect to see anchoring an exhibition on this topic, the landscape painters. I began looking at what landscape painters did during the war and how their works were received, and the more I read, the more I ran across language that described the war and the effect that it had on the lives of men and women, those who fought and those who remained at home, couched in metaphors of the weather and the terrain. What came into focus was a rich vocabulary of storms, comets, auroras, earthquakes, volcanoes, in the writings of Whitman, Melville, of Duncanson, and Lincoln, Douglas, and Stowe. All of their works resonate with landscape imagery that posits nature as a sanctuary where freedom is associated with open spaces. But during the war years, the images and the metaphors of land and weather tended toward destabilization. Thunderstorms raged, volcanoes erupted, and in both words and pictures, the world as we knew it came apart. The artist's paintings, contemporary photographs, and the words used by common men and women, as well as abolitionists, secessionists, slaves, and freedmen, all underscore the power of landscape and weather imagery to shape their world. Emily Dickinson wrote, "War seems to me an oblique place. I don't think anyone has summed it up better." And with the saturation of landscape imagery used to describe feelings about the war during the war, why then would you stop short of applying those same feelings and images when viewing a painting, or for that matter, when making one? During the first half of the 19th century, landscape painting represented American life and values. Landscape metaphors and imagery permeated the consciousness of this country. In the paintings made during the war years, the skies and the geography tell a version of the story, bringing together literary metaphor and visual imagery to create a war-inflected layer of meaning. When we consider those writings that evoked stormy weather and volcanic eruptions and celestial portents to understand the war and its profound consequences, that imagery gains in depth and the painting's meanings become clearer. Landscape painting became the emotional barometer of the mood of the nation. Martin Johnson Head's Approaching Thunderstorm of 1859 points to the single most prevalent metaphor used in describing the turmoil of the war years: storms. The alliance between the fate of man and the state of nature was never more tightly interwoven than in the years surrounding the Civil War. In 1854, the Missouri artist George Caleb Bingham had predicted anxiously that the political tension was, in his words, a storm now brewing in the north, which will sweep onward with a fury which no human force can withstand. Throughout the 1850s, tensions rise. War seems ever more certain, but no one knows what will trigger it or where or when it will start. He had responded to this overwhelming tension. In the spring of 1860, he displayed this painting of a darkening sky over an inlet near Port Judith, Rhode Island. He titled the work, Approaching Thunderstorm. On a strip of sand running across the foreground, a man and his dog sit quietly as a storm blackens the entire sky. A thin coral streak of lightning, which I'm afraid is probably next to invisible for you, but trust me, it's actually right there, splits the darkness, prefiguring the thunder and the rain to come. Two boats on the water make haste for the safety of the shore, but overall, the scene conveys an otherworldly calm in the face of an imminent disaster. Heed's seated figure occupies a prominent place in the composition, but he's remarkably passive in demeanor, as though he is a powerless spectator to the impending drama. As a presidential candidate in 1860, Abraham Lincoln had spoken of a coming storm when God would run out of patience on the issue of slavery. The metaphor was well established by the time Lincoln invoked it. Writing of slavery in 1817, Jesse Torrey wrote, "It is a black, accumulating, threatening thundercloud on our moral horizon, the sudden explosion of which might produce dangerous and fatal consequences." The metaphor became popular among abolitionist preachers, at least two of whom owned Heed's thunderstorm paintings from this moment. Charismatic abolitionist preacher Henry Ward Beecher already owned one of Heed's 1859 thunderstorm paintings when his colleague Noah Schenck acquired this painting shortly after it first went on public view. Their interest confirms that perceptive viewers often saw parallels between these paintings, current events, and their religious beliefs. Heed was among Beecher's occasional parishioners at his Plymouth church in Brooklyn, along with fellow artists Frederick Church and Eastman Johnson. And Schenck may have had this newly acquired painting in mind when he delivered a sermon in May 1861 in which he said, "From the storms which sweep the political horizon, it is held that Christ's officers should go forth to the fulfillment of their plainly revealed duty and breast the storms which sweep across the spiritual horizon." Schenck, Beecher, and a host of like-minded preachers across the North spoke of the rising need to confront slavery as a Christian moral battle, to stand up and take action in what they called these overdarkened days. Heed's seated figure, watching as the dramatic events unfold around him, seems emblematic of the majority in the North that viewed abolitionists as troublemakers and preferred to wait rather than to take action. The summer and fall of early 1860 was an unusually active time for atmospheric phenomenon. Comets, meteors, even the Aurora Borealis was visible up and down the eastern seaboard. Newspaper articles and letters to the editor spoke to the broad ripple of unease and fear associated with these events. Anyone seeking portents of war and celestial activity felt vindicated by the meteors that held much of Eastern America spellbound during July and August. Frederick Edwin Church was among them. On July 20th, a meteor streaked across the eastern sky. This was no ordinary meteor, and its appearance was met with no ordinary interest among scientists and amateur enthusiasts alike. The cover page you see here of Harper's Weekly on Saturday, August 4th, ran 3 wood-engraved images of the meteor as its lead story. What Church and so many others saw and remarked upon was a large Earth-grazing meteor, so called when the meteor's trajectory is within the Earth's atmosphere, but the meteor itself never hits the ground. The New York Times wrote that high on the Hudson River, the meteor was seen under very favorable circumstances from the Catskill Mountain House Plateau. It seemed to those at that point to be within a few feet of them and appeared to strike the valley. Church witnessed this strange display and captured the beginning of the meteor's breakup in this small, unearthly painting he titled Meteor of 1860. He painted the unusual phenomenon with its double fireball streaking across the center of the small canvas like a rocket illuminating the night sky. Accounts of the meteor's transit filled the newspapers up and down the coast, as far west as Cincinnati and St. Louis. In both North and South, commentators linked the eerie phenomenon to the lurking fear of war. Though we're a nation enamored of the burgeoning sciences, Americans still look to religion to help explain the unexplainable. Most Americans, whatever their race or faith, would invoke religion throughout the war to justify their position and give form to their hopes and fears. The Bible served up parables of divine retribution in the antics of the sky. In the North, abolitionists feared God was angry they had not done enough to abolish slavery. And in the South, the sky became a specter for the fear of Northern retribution. And among millions of African Americans, both enslaved and free, word of the meteor provided an emblem of possible liberation and justice. During the 1850s, meteors had come to be associated with the abolitionist John Brown, the man whose actions many consider to have triggered the Civil War. Contemporary poets likened Brown to a meteor, his fiery trajectory across the political landscape compared to that of celestial bodies. His raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 and his subsequent execution became a flare in the night, an omen of future strife. A customs clerk who fancied himself a writer, Herman Melville, penned a poem linking the meteors of 1859 with John Brown, portraying him as an equally disturbing force of nature. Melville closed his poem, The Portent, with the lines that compared John Brown's beard with the tail of the meteor. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. Melville's cryptic phrases recognized that the strange celestial sighting, like Brown's raid, had upended nocturnal stargazing and suffused even that pastime with unease. Walt Whitman also witnessed the earth-grazing meteor that inspired Church's painting. His poem of 1860 is titled Year of Meteors. In it, he reflects on Lincoln's election and Brown's hanging, proclaiming, "Year of meteors, brooding year, I would bind in words retrospective some of your deeds and signs. I would sing how an old man, tall with white hair, mounted the scaffold in Virginia." Whitman reiterated the connection between the effect of Brown's actions and the appearance of this particular meteor, comparing Brown to the comet that came unannounced out of the north, flaring in heaven, a strange, huge meteor procession, dazzling and clear, shooting over our heads. A moment long, it sailed its balls of unearthly light o'er our heads, then departed, dropped in the night, and was gone. For Whitman, John Brown was the meteor in the night sky, the portent of unavoidable sectional strife centered on the issue of slavery. For Frederick Church, the concept of the North became more than a geographic term in the years leading up to the war. In reaction to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, the Albany Evening Journal's editor Thurlow Weed proclaimed, "There will be a North," implying that it was time for the free states to coalesce their political power and stand up for their beliefs. Metaphors identifying the Arctic with the North and the tropics with the American South permeated political rhetoric. In Congress, icebergs was an emotional imagery charged with a symbol of the North as a need to assert itself on matters of slavery and federal sovereignty. A cartoon published on March 9, 1861 in Harper's Weekly is titled "Our Great Iceberg Melting Away," and it depicts President Buchanan as a hapless iceberg liquefying under the stern gaze of Lincoln as the sun. Church was at the same time putting the finishing touches on a major painting derived from his trip to Newfoundland and Labrador the preceding summer. On April 12, 1861, a month after that cartoon was published, Confederate forces in Charleston, South Carolina, opened artillery fire on the federally controlled Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. After a day and a half of bombardment, the Union forces surrendered the fort. At that point, no other news mattered. Church's Icebergs, which you see here, was scheduled to debut 11 days later on April 24th. Suddenly, all of the publicity and anticipation for the unveiling of this painting seemed like an afterthought compared to news of the Confederate attack and Lincoln's call for troops to defend Washington. Church faced a difficult choice. He could delay his unveiling, hoping for a calmer moment, or stay on schedule. He opted for the latter, forging ahead with the debut of his latest great picture. However, in deference to the war's onset and the patriotic sentiment sweeping New York City, he changed the title from The Icebergs to The North, Church's picture of icebergs. He deliberately made a connection between his painting and the new state of the nation. And altering the title was not the artist's only accommodation to the moment. In a calculated public gesture, he announced that the painting was exhibited to raise money for the newly established Union Patriotic Fund, created to benefit the families of Union soldiers. Fellow artist Eugene Benson gave a nod to Thurlow Weed's earlier pronouncement on geopolitics when he titled his review of this painting, "There is a North, Church's Last Work." The North, as a concept and as a painting, became caught in the crosshairs of history and linked to the Union cause. But if icebergs symbolized the North, it was South American volcanoes that stood in for the American South. Under Church's brush, Cotopaxi erupted in 1862 as the nation moved into the bloodiest year of the war. The painting presents a panoramic sweep of the Andean Plateau, dominated by the cinder cone of the powerful volcano. The smoke and ash rolling from the caldera drift down the side of the mountain, nearly obliterating the surrounding landscape in a superheated wave. The landscape is literally fracturing underfoot, reflecting the tumult of an unstable nation in a war with no end in sight. Although Cotopaxi is not a painting specifically about the Civil War, it is a landscape suffused with it. Church's friend Louis Le Grand Noble described the sulfurous Andean Plateau as this great battlefield of nature's forces, and a reviewer writing for the Albion described the ash-laden sky of this painting as war clouds rolling dun that eclipsed the light. In the American press, volcanoes were described in terms of bombs or heavy artillery, the ash clouds reminiscent of the cannon smoke that drifted across the battlefield. In a review of Church's painting, the New York Tribune described volcanoes as pillars of warning rather than of guidance. Cotopaxi was viewed as envisioning what many newspapers called the great national crisis, embodying the warring elements in the battle between light and dark. The cross of light formed by the haze of the setting sun was deemed to be an omen of redemption, leaving hope, albeit dimmed by brimstone, that when the smoke cleared, the cross of light shimmering in the rear distance would in fact confirm that God had not abandoned America. Volcanoes were also widely invoked as harbingers of the war's societal upheavals. As the war began, Frederick Douglass delivered an address in June of 1861 titled The American Apocalypse, in which he affirmed, "Slavery is felt to be a moral volcano, a burning lake, a hell on earth, the smoke and stench of whose torments ascend upward forever. Every breeze that sweeps over it comes to us tainted with its foul miasma and weighed down with the sighs and groans of its victims." A little over a year later, as Church completed Cotopaxi, the moral volcano of slavery became the central burning issue of the war itself, with Lincoln's announcement of the Provisional Emancipation Proclamation of September 22, 1862. Cotopaxi, infused with natural history and steeped with the imagery of cataclysmic moral and social upheaval, was a mirror of its time, a multivalent emblem of America's internal war. In a sermon delivered in 1859 at an African Methodist Episcopal church in Pittsburgh, the Reverend J.S. Martin preached about the death of John Brown and proclaimed, "It is thought by the slaves that the meteors from the heavens are sparks that strike upon the craters of volcanoes, and that is the cause of their eruption. From the firmament of Providence today, a meteor has fallen. It has fallen upon the volcano of American sympathies, and though for a while it may seem to sleep, yet its igneous power shall communicate to the slumbering might of the volcano, and it shall burst forth in one general conflagration of revolution that shall bring about universal freedom." Race slavery was North America's volcano, a simmering force, hidden and suppressed, but waiting to erupt explosively. It was a potent image that caught fire across the North. Volcanoes, fireballs, and meteors alike became associated with the burning issue of slavery in America. The war years proved to be a bounty for celestial portents. The preponderance of meteors, comets, and auroras made it seem as though the American skies, north and south, were witness to an apocalyptic battle overhead that rivaled the rolling war done on the ground. Chief among the phenomena invoking apocalypse and the days of judgment were the Aurora Borealis, eerie, silent flickerings of lurid light that rippled across the sky like a nocturnal, unhinged rainbow. They conjured images of nature out of control, appearing and disappearing with no warning. From the 1850s, the appearance of the auroras spurred lengthy accounts in local newspapers that combined scientific data with astrological interpretations. In 1860, polar explorer Isaac Israel Hayes outfitted an expedition on a vessel he had recently rechristened the SS United States. He sailed from New York in July and wintered over, trapped in the Arctic pack ice. His safe return in October 1861 was cause for celebration, a rare bright spot in a winter dark with war. The SS United States had survived an Arctic winter and returned intact, which was more than could be said for its namesake, the ship of state. At a lecture on his experiences, Hayes ruefully noted, "Since we last met in this hall, great changes have taken place. When I left the regions of eternal ice, I little dreamed that a powerful rebellion was desolating my country and that civil war was raging among a people which I left prosperous and happy. This great national calamity alters the relations under which we now meet, but God willing, I trust yet to carry the flag of our great republic with not a single star erased from its glorious union to the extreme northern limits of the earth." Hayes cast polar exploration as a form of patriotism and endurance as a northern value. Framed against this backdrop, Church's painting The Aurora Borealis took shape on his easel during the winter and early spring of 1864 to 65. Under a dark Arctic sky, an explorer's ship lies frozen in the pack ice at the base of a looming cliff. Lights inside the vessel signal a human presence, and the tiny dog sled making its way toward the ship encourages thoughts of rescue from an icy tomb. As the ice grips the SS United States and by proxy the nation, the auroras snake across the Arctic winter sky like a grim warning from God, a bleak foreshadowing of doom. Hayes spoke eloquently and extensively about the brilliant auroras he witnessed on his trip, emphasizing the biblical and apocalyptic overtones of the phenomenon, noting that the strange light glowed as if the air were filled with charnel meteors, pulsating with wild inconstancy over some vast, illimitable city of the dead. Church's Aurora Borealis is suffused with this vision of the Arctic night, rendering this illimitable place with a powerful sense of melancholy and discord. Artist and explorer present the Arctic as an unearthly landscape that functions as the inverse of paradise. By this time, it was difficult to find a description of an aurora that did not link it in some way with the war. In the north, a cartoon printed in Harper's Weekly showed a Confederate general cowering at the advancing northern lights, which appear to be the oncoming Union Army. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, as General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. Less than a week later, John Wilkes Booth, unable to accept the defeat of the Confederacy, shot and killed the president. Lincoln's assassination rocked what little stability remained. In Henry Ward Beecher's words, the assassination was so terrible that it first stunned sensibility. Citizens were like men awakened at midnight by an earthquake, bewildered to find everything that they were accustomed to trust wavering and falling. The very earth was no longer solid. Amidst the aftershocks, the National Academy of Design opened its spring exhibition, delayed in deference to Lincoln's death. On the walls was a painting Sanford Gifford had completed in 1863 titled The Coming Storm. Clouds heavy with rain sweep across the scene, darkening the surface below. The weather is in motion, a swirling vortex of dark clouds blotting out the light that suffuses the middle distance. What made this painting stand out were the circumstances surrounding its display. Gifford's painting bore the notation that it was owned by the Shakespearean actor Edwin Booth, brother to the president's assassin. Edwin was well known and well liked among the artists and writers who rallied around him for support. Gifford's painting became a touchstone for grieving New Yorkers who flocked to see it on display. The poignant connection between Gifford's storm, Edwin Booth's personal anguish, and the nation's grief lent deeper meaning to this painting. Had it not been for the circumstances surrounding the exhibition in April 1865 in the wake of Lincoln's assassination, The Coming Storm would have simply been another picture of turbulent weather, open to interpretation as indicative of the emotional turmoil at the midpoint of the war. The pathos prompted Herman Melville, by then a friend of Gifford's, to write a poem specifically about the triangulation of painting, owner, and fallen president. Melville's battle piece cemented the connection between Gifford's painting and the tragedy of the war. He titled his poem The Coming Storm, a picture by S.R. Gifford and owned by E.B., included in the N.A. exhibition April 1865. Melville's turn of phrase interpreted Gifford's storm as emblematic of Edwin's emotional state as well as that of the nation. He was not alone in doing so. A reviewer in the New York Leader could not envision this painting out of its newly assigned elegiac context, writing, The gem of the whole collection, The Coming Storm by S.R. Gifford, is the property of Edwin Booth, who little thought when he became its possessor of the coming storm under which he, together with our whole country, is bent in mourning. The awful silence of the picture can be felt, I felt, in all its mingled grandeur and wild, unearthly mournfulness. At the same time, in the same galleries, Albert Bierstadt's Looking Down Yosemite Valley, California, glowed from the easel like Eden reborn. This was his first large-scale painting of the site. A majestic sunset floods the valley with intense yellow light. The sun-drenched California landscape teems with the elements of life: water, air, trees, and glowing sunlight. But unique to Bierstadt's many pictures of Yosemite, it is unpopulated. Looking Down Yosemite Valley is devoid of animals, birds, or human beings. It seems to signal a new Eden after the biblical flood, awaiting the arrival of the ark to usher in a new future for mankind. Bierstadt's reaction to his first view of the Yosemite Valley is recorded in a letter of August 1863 to his friend John Hay, President Lincoln's personal secretary. "We are now here in the Garden of Eden, I call it, the most magnificent place I was ever in, and I employ every moment painting from nature." His companion, the travel writer Fitzhugh Ludlow, made it official in an article in the Atlantic Monthly when he pronounced, "If the report was true, we were going to the original site of the Garden of Eden." It was a prophetic and calculated statement of hope and redemption for war-torn America. As such, Bierstadt's painting is the antithesis of Church's keening Arctic wasteland, representing a return to the transcendental vision that had anchored American landscape painting from its roots and nourished it to full flower in the years leading up to the war. Whether the West could assume the mantle and the burden of the nation's character, whether the landscape could still function as a place of spiritual renewal and endless possibility was yet to be known. Bierstadt's paintings of Yosemite held out the promise of a new Eden, a place in which all Americans could slough off the trauma of war and sectarian strife, a place of renewal and healing. But despite the promise of Bierstadt's Eden, it would not be so easy to recover from this war. There is no doubt that the lasting damage of the war was the literal and psychological destruction of the landscape, especially and principally in the South. That damage stretched well beyond the destruction of crops and homes to the infrastructure of a Southern agrarian economy and no fewer than 4 of its major cities. Photographer George Barnard, whose works you see here, accompanied General William Tecumseh Sherman's troops on their march to the sea in 1864, chronicling the dismantling of Southern society and the ultimate capitulation of its citizens. Sherman himself recognized the grim irony of what it would take to win the war, noting in Georgia that, quote, "The scene was enchanting, too beautiful to be disturbed by the harsh clamor of war. But the Chattahoochee lay beyond, and I must reach it." Faced with appeals from Atlanta's mayor to spare the city, Sherman wrote, "You might as well appeal against the thunderstorm as against the terrible hardships of war." The ensuing bitterness that permeated Reconstruction in the South came from dual causes: the realization that the North went back to business as usual rather quickly, having sustained little or no damage of this nature, and that federal promises to repair and rebuild were often more broken or twisted than fulfilled. As we've witnessed in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, those broken promises, however well-intended, echo across the endless rubble of ravaged cities and devastated land, scarring the South for generations to come. Winslow Homer turned his attention to a painting in which landscape and figure merge into a meditation on the difficulties of returning home. Veteran in a New Field, painted in the summer of 1865, incorporates several complicated layers of meaning. The picture is foremost about re-engaging with civilian society and providing sustenance for family and community. Homer's veteran is back to work in his fields, scythe in hand, reaping the summer's bountiful harvest. He stands in his shirt sleeves, his army jacket and canteen discarded on the ground behind him. His straw hat shelters his head from the noonday sun, and the uncut wheat, standing nearly as tall as the soldier, gleams in the light. The idea of a reaper, in this case returning to a harvest of plenty rather than a harvest of death, comforted many contemporary reviewers. On the surface of this painting, all seems well. The soldier has returned, his household reunited like the country, his actions nurturing a prosperous future. For those who remained at home, wheat fields symbolized the North's prosperity. It's a crop harvested by free men for individual and communal sustenance. But in Homer's painting, that agrarian landscape harbors a more complicated message. The vast majority of Civil War battles were fought in corn and wheat fields. Soldiers' accounts of the battles often made reference to the irony of fighting in such places. During the war, harvest metaphors and images of grim reapers permeated newspapers and journals, making it impossible for anyone paying attention to current events to avoid or deny such images. Union General Joe Hooker, describing the carnage at Antietam, recalled, "Every stalk in the northern part of the cornfield was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife. The slain lay in rows, precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few minutes before." Homer's veteran moves away from us, deeper into the wheat field. As he does so, the cut wheat stacks up behind his legs, trapping him between the harvest and the standing stalks. The only way for this veteran to move forward is to scythe the wheat, much as the soldiers had mowed down their enemies. He cannot retreat, for the cut stalks behind him block his backward step. But what runs through the unnamed veteran's head each time he swings that scythe? Wheat fills his field of vision as the memories of battle fill his head. In 1877, Homer painted a work called The Cotton Pickers. The artist here has drawn clear distinctions between the two women and used the landscape to frame a question about the future that each woman faces. The young woman on the left looks down at her work, her fingers gently trailing against the soft bowls. Cotton surrounds her, flowing from her basket, encircling her skirts. Absorbed in her thoughts, she is far distant from the here and now, though her world is circumscribed by the work she has done in the fields. Her companion radiates a far different demeanor. Head up, eyes alert, she gazes with determination at what lies beyond the cotton fields. Her sack holds the cotton she's harvested, but might as easily double for a sack of her belongings should she dare to step forward and out of the field. She appears to be contemplating just such an action, taking advantage of opportunity and initiative to chart a new path, a new future. Frederick Douglass described an enslaved person as a creature of the past and present who craved a future with hope in it. Homer's cotton pickers stop in their tracks, each contemplating her past, her present, and her future. One may remain lost in the past and the present, surrounded by a sea of cotton. The other craves what the future holds. Stalks of cotton snag her apron and appear to slow her progress, but providentially, Homer has placed her in front of a break in the row of cotton plants. She needs only to take the next step to free herself of her past and engage in the space we occupy. In his post-war paintings blending landscape and genre, Homer's message is clear. Both here and in Veteran in a New Field, it will be up to each individual to determine what kind of future lies ahead. And for America, that landscape is no longer the backdrop for a shared national dialogue, but is a protagonist in the struggle to reinvent that nation. A fitting place to end is in considering the landscapes of John Frederick Kensett, who found a lyrical way to use landscape painting to express the sense of loss that accompanied the conflict. Kensett had never donned a uniform, although he had served tirelessly on the art committee of the U.S. Sanitary Commission's Metropolitan Fair of 1864. He never painted any works that might readily be classified as war pictures, but in 1859, he first painted the appropriately named Sunrise Among the Rocks of Paradise, Newport. He depicts the sheltered valley in morning tones of pink and pale gold, the rising sun's glow beginning to warm the surface of the rocks. The ducks rise from the pond's surface to greet the day. The bright green grass suggests that it's spring, a season of hope and renewal. The peaceful setting appears to be a kind of understated paradise, a place for calm reflection. It is a serene picture, an oasis far from the bustle of the world, a sanctuary for the mind as well as the heart. 6 years later, Kensett returned to this haunt and painted a nearly identical composition, yet the season and the mood have changed. In Paradise Rocks, Newport of 1866, a cold front moving in from the west suggests the chill of fall or early winter. Kensett's palette is muted. The ducks seem to contemplate their own departure, the distant birds like the somber mood and overcast sky speaking to loss. Poet Emily Dickinson found words to express that sense of loss implicit in such a scene. Her poem about death, titled "There's Something Quieter Than Sleep," ends with the stanza, While simple-hearted neighbors chat of the early dead, we, prone to periphrasis, remark that birds have fled. Dickinson's use of birds in flight as a metaphor for an untimely death carries pregnant meaning for a war-torn country, as so many Americans grappled with the loss of friends and family members. In a similar vein, Kensit's moody palette and the birds aloft resonate with Emily Dickinson's meditation on the quality of death. The weather is the salient difference between Kensit's pictures of Paradise Rocks. When placing these two paintings from 1859 and 1866 side by side, it is not the landscape that has changed, but the artist's and the viewer's experience of it that has been forever altered over the course of the war. Kensit has painted the loss of innocence manifest in our experience of the landscape, a measure of the depth of a change that cannot be undone. In these two quiet paintings, Kensit has created a eulogy for the demise of the Hudson River School. Unlike the great pictures of Church and Bierstadt or the glowing Universalist light of Sanford Gifford, Kensit's melancholy interpretation of his local paradise is intensely personal and yet effectively universal. They're a threnody for the shift from the literal landscape to the metaphorical, and ultimately to the psychological landscape, reflecting the mood and the inner state of the artist. The landscape has not changed, but our expectations for it have been altered. The viewer is no longer the same. Shaped by war, the returning soldier casts new eyes on familiar scenes, returning a stranger to once familiar groves. Kensit's post-war paintings embody a shift in landscape as a vehicle for changes of mood, changes of mind, changes of heart, paintings about loss and recovery. Yet implicit in the timelessness of the rocks is the recognition that life goes on regardless of change. In his role as president of the Artists' Fund Society, Kensit delivered remarks at the annual meeting in February of 1866. He expressed his sorrow and relief that 4 years of civil conflict, which has covered God's green fields with fraternal blood, carrying ruin and desolation into countless homes, has ended. Victory has crowned our arms, and smiling peace has once more come. The storm long threatened, which burst with such terrific and long-continued fury over the land, has given place to skies purified, to a nation redeemed and reunited. Yearning for the truth behind his words, Kensit expressed the hope of his generation, that war could truly be over and peace would usher in a reunited landscape devoid of the trauma that had afflicted it. In 1873, Mark Twain observed, "The 8 years in America from 1860 to 1868 uprooted institutions that were centuries old, changed the politics of a people, transformed the social life of half the country, and wrought so profoundly upon the entire national character that the influence cannot be measured short of 2 or 3 generations." Like Walt Whitman, Twain recognized the impossibility of capturing the impact of the real war in real time. And yet the real-time clamor for responses to the war, both literary and artistic, encouraged some of this country's finest writers and artists to do just that, to give meaningful voice to the ongoing or recently concluded upheaval, and to provide insight into the cost of the war in human terms. By the war's end, landscape painting's concept of America as the new Eden had yielded to a more sober vision of a nation trying to find its way back to the garden. The Civil War had profound and lasting impact on American art, as it did on American culture as a whole. The conflict had left no aspect of American life unscathed, and traces of its presence remained long after the fighting was done. As such, the Civil War exists as an integral layer of meaning in the arts made in the years surrounding the conflict, and must be reckoned with as an essential aspect of our understanding of these works of art and of the artists who made them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. We have some time for questions, if you have any. If you do, Katie and Molly actually have microphones, and we do need to use those mics for recording purposes right now. We'll also have an opportunity to spend some time with Eleanor back in the multipurpose room with coffee and teas and tea if you also have questions. Do you have any questions now? Taking it all in.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It was excellent. I just missed a detail. when you were talking about Sherman, who was the photographer that went along
His
with him?
name is George Barnard, and he's probably the best Civil War photographer you've never heard of.
That's right.
He's an interesting man. He was born in Syracuse, and he ended up working for first Matthew Brady and then Alexander Gardner during the early stages of the war. And in 1863, he was asked to become the staff photographer for Sherman's Western Division in Mississippi, right about the time that Grant made Sherman the head of that. And so he ends up first in Nashville and then in Chattanooga. He will end up following Sherman to Atlanta, Savannah, Charleston, Columbia, and Richmond. It's quite clear he's shaken by what he sees. And when he goes back to New York after being discharged from the Army, he puts together an album of 100 of his photographs chronicling Sherman's marches throughout the South and the end of the war. But in doing so, I've always had the suspicion that it wasn't about triumph, it was really about educating a Northern audience about what was happening in the South, because the experiences of the war are so vastly different depending on whether you are in New York City or Philadelphia, where the war got kind of close at Gettysburg, and that was a little bit frightening, but it's not the same thing as having it explode throughout your city. Barnard will actually end up in Charleston in 1869 and open a business there. He's the only one of the major Civil War photographers who doesn't pick up and go west with the geological surveys and with the exploration of Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. And so I think he's a very different character, and I'm pleased to have 8 of his works in the exhibition this fall. And there's a chapter on landscape painting that really looks at, not landscape painting, on photography, that really looks at the way that photography comes of age and how the different photographers end up creating a vision of what the war was about, not so much documenting it as it is opening up possibilities for interpretation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have his name right, but is it Eastman Johnson?
Eastman Johnson, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about him and his artwork?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Johnson's a really interesting character. He is from rural Maine. His family is actually a Democratic family when they arrive in Washington. His father is working for the newly elected Democratic senator from Maine. And so Johnson's entree into New York City to Washington, D.C. in the late 40s and early 50s is steeped in politics. Johnson will go overseas for 5 years. He'll come back when his mother dies. I think the pivotal event for Johnson in terms of a split with his father over politics is that his dad will remarry into George Washington's family, and his second wife will bring 3 enslaved people into the family. And Johnson at that point paints Mount Vernon, but he paints it from the backside, the slave quarters, not from the portico. He skips his dad's wedding. And he paints Negro life at the South. And I think in that picture, what he is basically doing is questioning the definition of race on the eve of war. It's the idea that how can you designate a person as property based on skin color? And throughout the Civil War years, he will paint subtle but hard-hitting pictures that really present Black people as fully fledged human beings with the entire emotional spectrum that we expect out of the white population, so that he forces his audience to deal with their issues as our issues. And so when you see Ride for Liberty, you are there with the family, hoping like crazy that they're actually going to make it to freedom. When you see that Black man gripping that Bible, looking to achieve literacy, wanting citizenship, wanting to be a fully fledged part of this country, you're there with him as kind of an aspirational thing. And so what Johnson really does is he breaks from his father and really then uses his art to give voice to some rather well-formed and very, I think, firmly held beliefs about abolition and equality.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
Did it cause a permanent rift between him and his family?
I suspect it did, but we're a little bit thin on the primary documentation. Johnson will spend a lot more time with other family members than he does not ever go back to Washington, D.C. And so the only thing that I can surmise from that is that there wasn't the kind of warm, tearful reunion where all is forgiven. They basically just lived separate lives after that. Yeah.
You quoted Duncanson and you mentioned Stowe briefly in the literary parts, and I'm curious whether in the larger version of the exhibition and the book, there are some women visual artists as part of this project?
Sadly, no, there aren't. They take their place in the literary canon, but one of the tricky things about putting together an exhibition like this is at some level you have to decide what your bookends are in order to tell a coherent story. And one of the things I really wanted to understand was how did the fine arts shape or have the potential for changing the way people thought about slavery, about abolition, about what the country meant, and about what kind of country needed to come out of this. During the 1850s and 1860s, there were very few, if any, women artists who were given that kind of training and that kind of pride of place. That really is the next generation of artists that's going to end up with that. And so, yes, they are out there, but their works weren't seen. And when you hang them in proximity with the works that are by the artists who had the best training, it becomes difficult to be able to give them a way to tell their story effectively. They get overshadowed by what's happening. So what I ended up doing was trying to find in an understanding that I firmly believe that nobody gets away unscathed. If you're alive during the Civil War years, you are shaped, reshaped, and changed by the experience. And so the trick is, how do you find the 55 or 60 most eloquent objects to make the case for how profound that change is, even when it's not the absolute surface layer meaning in a particular work of art. And so what I aimed for were paintings that would have been publicly displayed, publicly reviewed, written about, argued about at the time. What were the game changers in all of that? What that leaves you with is a pretty white male canon. Robert Duncanson, as a mulatto artist living in Cincinnati, is in the exhibition. He probably is the best known artist of color who was working at the time, and of course his story is incredibly poignant. Cincinnati is a hotbed for abolition. He should be in really good shape there. With pale skin, he's able to navigate the color barrier without a lot of prejudice, but it's very clear he feels he's on a tightrope the entire time. And there's a really interesting exchange with his son Reuben, who obviously feels his father should have been more of an activist, more like a Frederick Douglass, than basically trying to make a decent living for his family and keep everybody safe. And I think it really hurts Duncanson's feelings to have his son basically say, you've basically abandoned your race, you've become white. And so that issue of passing for white, where if you can, you have an easier time in a majority white culture, but your black heritage then almost becomes forfeit as a result. And wrestling with the idea of identity during this time period is something that everybody has to grapple with at some point or another. And that's definitely in there. But Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is clearly the literary lightning rod, and it's the one that Eastman Johnson actually grabs onto. There's a fabulous quote from the review of Negro Life at the South where the reviewer basically says that what Stowe and Johnson did was take on the taboo of calling slavery for what it is. And they said, Stowe broke the spell in literature, Johnson did it in art. And it's the idea that at that point, fiction wasn't supposed to be political. And the rule that she broke was it became a really hotly contested political diatribe, and the South sort of cried no fair, and Stowe's kind of like, too bad. And Johnson's sort of doing the same thing. He is investing genre painting, which used to be about, corrupt politicians, drunk voters, people dancing, people harvesting. It was sort of, if you will, kind of the congenial underbelly of democracy. It's all the fun, irreverent stuff that happens that makes democracy so interesting. And what happens with Johnson and Homer is it's like genre painting wakes up, sobers up, and starts asking really hard questions about the way we behave and who we do and don't acknowledge as full partners in American society. And it's a radical shift in the role that genre painting will play at that time and afterward. Yes?
My question is about your process.
Yeah.
You have an impeccable variety of primary source documents at your fingertips. Did you have a moment of surprise? And if so, could you describe that discovery?
What a great question. Actually, a number of years ago, I was confronted by a fair number of my colleagues in, my specialization is in landscape painting, and so I had people who would say to me, well, you know, the landscape painter's got a free pass. A lot of them didn't enlist, they don't ever paint the war, they don't paint the commemorative landscapes at Gettysburg and Antietam, and I can tell you painting cornfields is not very interesting. You know, they're off looking at scenery, and instead you're confronted with wide open spaces, which they didn't tend to gravitate toward. But, you know, I kept struggling with the idea because fundamentally American landscape painting is predicated on the notion that we are the new Eden. We are God's chosen people, you know, 3 cheers for us. We're better than you are in Europe. And we have this fabulous destiny in front of us and westward the course of empire and everything is just hunky-dory and great. And, you know, kaboom, Cain kills Abel at first Manassas. Well, I think you get kicked out of the garden for behavior like that. And if you're flawed and mortal and roaming the earth once more, what happens to the Garden of Eden? What happens to landscape painting? What happens to your whole sense of self-identity that you've wrapped up in pictures of Natural Bridge and Niagara Falls? And, you know, what happens to that optimism? And I just could not bring myself to believe that they were tone deaf to the whole thing, immune to it, or just simply going, no, 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 none of this is happening. And there's plenty of that. All I really want is sanctuary. Sanford Gifford will spend 3 summers in uniform, and every year when he gets out of uniform, he goes to the Catskills, and you can tell what he's trying to do is kind of forget what the last 3 months have been about and recover. And so he does what he calls his unwarlike pictures, which are the views of the Catskills, and then he paints what he calls his historico-military pictures, which are the pictures that he does when he is in uniform. And I started going back trying to understand what were these people showing during the war years? What were they painting? What were they talking about? What was in their letters? And literally it's one of those things that you are faced with the elephant in the room, and when you finally see it, it's everywhere. And I started realizing that every single quote that I was picking up from soldiers and from escaped slave narratives and from Lincoln and Douglas sparring with each other, somewhere along the line they start talking about the weather in terms of how they feel, and they start talking about the terrain in terms of obstacles and in terms of victories. There's a very poignant moment, and I think the aha moment for me, there's a painting in the exhibition called The Briarwood Pipe, which shows 2 soldiers in the uniforms of the Zouaves, those richly colored red and blue Algerian-inspired uniforms. And carving briarwood pipes is one of those things you did because you were bored. And there was a poem that was published called The Briarwood Pipe in which the soldiers thought that they could see the faces of their loved ones in the curling smoke coming up from them. So it's another picture about homesickness. And it's in the exhibition. It'll be next to Home Sweet Home. That whole idea of what the heck are we doing here? And will we survive to get home again? At the Second Battle of Manassas in August of 1862, dirty Zouaves were almost wiped out. I think that they said that, you know, over 750 of them died in 15 minutes. And their bodies were simply strewn across the fields out at Manassas. 2 separate soldiers, riding apart from each other, who were in Pope's brigade, wrote home. I lived in Texas for a while, so I understood exactly what they meant. When they were talking about what they saw, they said that the dead Zouaves looked like a field of Texas wildflowers. And if you've seen Indian bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush in the spring, it's basically just a riot of red and blue. You don't see any other color. And I just sort of sat back and I went, this is how they are both holding the gruesomeness at arm's length by giving it a beautiful face, but they are also sending back a riveting and powerful visual image that everyone back home will understand. And at that point, I realized I was onto something, that it was not so much in terms of what is the actual weather, although there are plenty of articles about how the weather affects war. And if you read about the Civil War, a lot of it took place in the rain. It always seemed to be raining somewhere. And so when you understand how much the weather inflects everything, whether these people go outside, whether they're going to make it up the hill, whether or not, how things were going to play out, the use of those visual metaphors then gave me the beginnings of a framework, the idea that, okay, this is what I need to be looking for. How are they processing what's happening to them? Are they able to grapple with it, or can they just not bring themselves to do it? And how does that then relate to everything else that's going on? Homer's Briarwood Pipe actually was on view just after Second Manassas. And the likelihood is that the people who looked at it would have very fresh memories of the description of the carnage as a backdrop for, again, having that poignant, empathetic moment, looking at these two poor soldiers who probably don't realize they'll be dead the next day. So that was what did it. It was the effort to then go to all of the first-person narratives that I could find. I really wanted you to experience the war through the words and the images of the people who survived it. It doesn't help if I quote my colleagues because we're all incredibly opinionated, and they're in the footnotes. They're there. Don't worry about it. They're there. But what I really wanted you to do was understand I'm not just making this up, and that it is coming from an overwhelming mass of material. There's a wonderful book, long out of print, by the two authors' last names are Eisenschimmel and Newman, and it's called Eyewitness to War. I think the original title was The War as I Knew It, and it's snippets from all of these primary sources. And it was like a cliff notes to where I needed to go and what I needed to see. And that may have been one of the most important resources for the light bulb going off, because it was just basically all there hitting me in the face, page after page after page. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your being here.